They like the killing too much. 5 words. Just 5 words buried in a classified Pentagon report that was never supposed to see the light of day. 5 words that summed up why America's most elite warriors, the legendary Green Berets, the men who trained Montagnard tribesmen, who ran suicide missions into Laos and Cambodia, were genuinely terrified of working alongside their own allies. Not the Viet Cong, not the NVA, their own allies. The Australian SAS. Now hold on. I know what you're thinking. Australians? Those laid-back guys from down under? What could possibly make battle-hardened American special forces, men who had seen the absolute worst that Vietnam had to offer, request emergency extraction rather than spend one more day alongside Australian operators? What did they witness in those jungles that shook them to their core? The answer has been classified for over 50 years, and what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War, about special operations, and about just how far men can transform themselves into something else. We're talking kill ratios that Pentagon analysts dismissed as impossible until they sent observers to verify. We're talking methods so controversial that American intelligence buried the reports rather than acknowledge what their allies were doing. We're talking about ordinary Australian sheep farmers and factory workers who became something the Viet Cong called Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, and feared more than American B-52 strikes. And here's what nobody tells you. Those same methods, that same culture, would explode into international scandal 50 years later with allegations that shocked the world. So what exactly were the Australians doing in those jungles? What did American Green Berets witness that haunted them for the rest of their lives? And why did the Pentagon decide that some secrets were better left buried? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why that 5-word assessment, "They like the killing too much," became the most controversial sentence ever written about America's closest allies. Let's get into it. The year was 1970, and a young American Special Forces sergeant named Michael DeLong stood at the edge of a jungle clearing in Phuoc Tuy Province, watching something that would haunt him for the next 53 years. 3 Australian SAS operators had just returned from a 10-day patrol, and what they carried with them made DeLong's blood run cold. These weren't the trophy hunters he'd heard whispers about back at Special Forces headquarters in Nha Trang. These were something else entirely. Something that made even battle-hardened Green Berets question everything they thought they knew about the art of killing. The Australians moved through the base camp at Nui Dat with an eerie silence that seemed almost supernatural. Their boots made no sound. Their eyes scanned constantly, even within the safety of their own perimeter. And the smell that clung to them, that unmistakable jungle rot mixed with something darker, told DeLong these men had been doing things in the bush that no official report would ever acknowledge. But what truly shook the American sergeant to his core wasn't the physical evidence. It was the look in their eyes, a calm, predatory patience that reminded him not of soldiers, but of something far more ancient, far more dangerous. This is the story that the Pentagon classified for decades. The story of why America's elite Green Berets, the legendary warriors who had trained Montagnard tribesmen, who had conducted the most daring operations of the entire Vietnam conflict, came to genuinely fear working alongside their Australian allies. Not because the Australians were incompetent, not because they were undisciplined, but because they were simply too effective, too willing to cross lines that even hardened American operators refused to approach. And the phrase that would echo through Special Forces bars from Fort Bragg to Okinawa for generations afterward? It came from a classified after-action report that was never supposed to see the light of day. A single sentence, written by an American liaison officer who had spent 6 months embedded with the Australian SAS in 1970. They like the killing too much. But that assessment, as damning as it sounds, barely scratched the surface of what was really happening in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province. The full truth was far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more fascinating than any American official dared to put in writing. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in 1966, with a reputation that preceded them by 2 decades. These were the descendants of the original British SAS, the legendary desert raiders who had terrorized Rommel's supply lines across North Africa during the Second World War. But the Australians had evolved the concept into something uniquely their own, something forged in the brutal counterinsurgency campaigns of Malaya and Borneo, something that would prove devastatingly effective against the Viet Cong. But the kill ratios were only the beginning of what would terrify American observers. The numbers alone told a story that American military planners simply could not believe. Throughout the entire Vietnam conflict, Australian SAS squadrons maintained a kill ratio that defied statistical probability. For every Australian SAS operator who fell in combat, the enemy lost somewhere between 500 and 1,000 fighters. American Special Forces units, despite their superior numbers and virtually unlimited resources, achieved ratios closer to 30 or 40 to 1. Pentagon analysts who examined these figures initially dismissed them as Australian exaggeration. Surely, no unit could be that effective. Surely the Australians were inflating their body counts the same way American commanders did throughout the war. But when American observers were finally sent to verify the claims, they discovered something that shook the foundations of American Special Operations doctrine. The Australians weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were underselling their effectiveness. The first American Green Beret to officially document his observations of Australian SAS methods was Captain Robert W. Channon, who spent 3 months attached to 2 Squadron SAS in early 1968. His classified report, which remained sealed until 1993, contained passages that read more like psychological horror than military analysis. Channon wrote that the Australians had developed what he called a completely different relationship with the jungle environment than American forces, where Americans fought the jungle, hacking through vegetation, spraying insect repellent, cursing the heat and humidity. The Australians seemed to merge with it. They moved through dense undergrowth without leaving visible trails. They communicated through hand signals so subtle that Channon often missed them entirely, and they could remain motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But it was the Australian approach to the enemy that truly disturbed Channon. American Special Operations doctrine emphasized reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Green Berets were trained to observe, report, and call in airstrikes or conventional forces when enemy concentrations were located. Direct engagement was often a last resort. The Australians operated under no such constraints. Their patrols went into the jungle with a single objective: to find the enemy and eliminate him with maximum psychological impact. Every contact was an opportunity not just to inflict casualties, but to spread terror through the Viet Cong infrastructure. And the methods they used to achieve this psychological effect would eventually lead to the most controversial assessment ever written about Allied special forces. What Channon discovered next would change everything American intelligence believed about their allies. To understand why Green Berets came to fear their Australian counterparts, one must first understand the radically different tactical philosophies that shaped each force. American Special Forces. Doctrine in Vietnam evolved from the Office of Strategic Services traditions of the Second World War. Unconventional warfare focused on training indigenous forces, gathering intelligence, and conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. Green Berets saw themselves as force multipliers, men whose primary value lay in their ability to organize and lead irregular fighters. The Australian SAS operated from an entirely different premise. Their doctrine, refined through years of jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo, centered on what they called reconnaissance in force. Small patrols that combined intelligence gathering with direct action. An Australian SAS patrol didn't just find the enemy. It engaged him. It eliminated him. And then it disappeared back into the jungle before reinforcements could respond. The typical Australian SAS patrol consisted of just 5 men. 5. Where American operations often involved platoon or company-sized elements, supported by helicopter gunships, artillery, and fast movers on standby. The Australians went in light, silent, and utterly alone. They carried everything they needed for patrols lasting up to 3 weeks. They ate cold rations to avoid cooking fires. They slept in the open, taking turns on watch through the endless tropical nights. And they eliminated targets with a methodical efficiency that American observers found genuinely unsettling. Sergeant First Class Thomas Harrigan, a Green Beret who participated in several joint operations with Australian SAS in 1969, described his first patrol with the Australians in terms that would become legendary within Special Forces circles. Harrigan wrote that on the 3rd day of the patrol, the Australian team leader raised his fist, signaling an immediate halt. The entire 5-man patrol froze in place. Harrigan, trained in American techniques, dropped to one knee and scanned for threats. The Australians didn't move at all. They simply stood, motionless, like statues in the green twilight of the jungle canopy. For the next 47 minutes, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Harrigan watched sweat drip down his face, felt insects crawling across his skin, and fought the overwhelming urge to shift his weight. The Australians might as well have been carved from stone. Then, without any signal that Harrigan could detect, the patrol leader moved forward 3 steps and pointed his weapon at what appeared to be an empty patch of jungle floor. 2 suppressed rounds coughed from his modified Sterling submachine gun, and a Viet Cong scout, who had been lying perfectly camouflaged not 10 feet away, shuddered and went still. The Australians had detected the enemy through some sense that Harrigan couldn't identify. Later, the patrol leader would explain that he had smelled the man. The faint odor of nuoc mam fish sauce that clung to every Viet Cong fighter's breath. The Australians had trained themselves to detect this scent at distances of up to 30 feet in favorable conditions. But that wasn't the part of the encounter that truly shocked Harrigan. What happened next would haunt his dreams for decades. The practice that would eventually lead to the infamous assessment about Australian bloodlust emerged from a calculated, psychological warfare strategy that the SAS had developed during the Malayan emergency. In Malaya, Australian and British forces had faced communist guerrillas who operated with near-total impunity among sympathetic civilian populations. Traditional military operations proved ineffective. Airstrikes and artillery barrages only alienated the locals. Sweep operations found nothing, because the guerrillas simply melted into the jungle and waited for the conventional forces to leave. What finally broke the back of the communist insurgency in Malaya was a systematic campaign of psychological terror directed at the guerrillas themselves. Small SAS patrols penetrated deep into the jungle, located guerrilla camps, and conducted raids designed not just to inflict casualties, but to shatter enemy morale. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. The jungle that the communists believed was their sanctuary had become their grave. The Australians brought these methods to Vietnam, and they refined them to a razor's edge. After eliminating the Viet Cong scout, the Australian patrol leader performed a ritual that Harrigan had heard rumors about but never witnessed. Using a specialized knife, he made a series of cuts across the soles of the enemy's feet. The incisions weren't deep enough to cause significant blood loss. They were something else entirely. In Viet Cong culture, the souls of the deceased were believed to walk to the afterlife. By mutilating the feet of their victims, the Australians were sending a message that would spread through enemy networks like wildfire. Those who encountered the Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, would not only perish, but their spirits would be condemned to crawl through eternity. Harrigan watched this ritual in stunned silence. He had participated in brutal combat throughout his 2 tours in Vietnam. He had called in napalm strikes on suspected enemy positions. He had supervised the interrogation of captured fighters, using techniques that would later be classified as torture. But this deliberate spiritual desecration, struck him as something beyond the pale. When he later confronted the Australian patrol leader about the practice, the response chilled him to the bone. The Australian, a laconic sergeant from Western Australia whose nickname was Tracker, simply shrugged and explained that the Americans didn't understand the enemy they were fighting. The Viet Cong weren't afraid of American firepower, Tracker said. They'd seen what American bombs and artillery could do, and they'd accepted it as the price of liberation. What terrified them, what kept them awake at night in their jungle camps, was the prospect of spiritual annihilation, of dying in a way that violated every sacred belief they held. And Tracker made it clear that he intended to exploit that fear to its fullest extent. But the cut boots were only the first revelation in a catalog of horrors. The classified reports that would eventually reach Pentagon analysts described a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that made Operation Phoenix, the CIA's notorious assassination program, look almost restrained by comparison. Australian SAS patrols operating in Phuoc Tuai province developed a repertoire of terror tactics designed to break enemy morale at its most fundamental level. Bodies of Viet Cong fighters were sometimes positioned in deliberate arrangements that conveyed specific messages. A patrol might eliminate 3 enemy soldiers and arrange them facing different directions, indicating that the jungle ghosts could strike from anywhere. Another patrol might leave a single survivor from an ambush, deliberately allowing him to escape so he could spread tales of what he had witnessed. The Australians learned to identify Viet Cong political officers, the true believers who maintained morale and discipline among the guerrilla fighters. And they targeted these individuals with particular ferocity. A political officer captured alive might be released after being forced to witness the elimination of his entire cell. The psychological impact of such experiences often proved more destructive to enemy operations than a dozen conventional engagements. And then there was the practice that American observers found most disturbing of all: the body displays. When Australian patrols eliminated high-value targets, supply officers, or particularly effective guerrilla leaders, they sometimes arranged the aftermath to maximize psychological impact. Bodies might be positioned prominently along known enemy trail networks. Warnings might be carved into nearby trees using knife points, and personal effects might be collected and later distributed through agent networks to reach the victim's family and comrades. The message was always the same: the jungle ghosts see everything. They know who you are. They know where you sleep. And when they come for you, there will be no escape. Not even in the afterlife. American Green Berets who witnessed these practices found themselves in an impossible position. On one hand, the tactics clearly worked. The Viet Cong developed a near-superstitious fear of Australian SAS patrols, often abandoning areas entirely rather than risk encountering the Ma Rung. Intelligence reports showed that enemy morale in Phuoc Tuy Province, the area of Australian responsibility, had collapsed to levels far below any other region of South Vietnam. On the other hand, what the Australians were doing clearly violated the laws of armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions specifically prohibited the mutilation of enemy casualties. They prohibited psychological warfare tactics designed to target spiritual or religious beliefs. They prohibited the deliberate terrorization of enemy combatants and their families. But here was the terrible truth that no American officer wanted to acknowledge. The Australian methods were working, and American methods were not. Yet, even these disturbing practices paled compared to what Pentagon investigators would uncover next. By 1970, the contrast between Australian and American effectiveness in Vietnam had become impossible to ignore. The Australian Task Force, operating with barely 3,000 troops at its peak strength, had achieved levels of security in Phuoc Tuy Province that tens of thousands of American soldiers couldn't replicate elsewhere. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the province had been shattered. Local villages that had provided support to the guerrillas now cooperated enthusiastically with Australian civic action programs. And the SAS patrols that ranged across the province had become objects of genuine terror among enemy forces. Meanwhile, American forces were bogged down in a war of attrition that showed no signs of reaching a successful conclusion. Despite deploying over 500,000 troops at peak strength, despite dropping more bomb tonnage than had been used in all of the Second World War, despite technological advantages that seemed almost miraculous, the American military could not break the enemy's will to fight. The Pentagon responded to this uncomfortable reality by dispatching a series of observers to study Australian methods and determine whether they could be adapted for American use. What these observers discovered would eventually lead to one of the most controversial classified assessments in Special Forces history. Major William K. Rosenfeld arrived at the Australian base at Nui Dat in March of 1970, with orders to spend 6 months embedded with SAS patrols. His mission was straightforward: learn what the Australians were doing differently and report on whether their methods could scale to American force levels. Rosenfeld was no stranger to unconventional warfare. He had commanded a MACV-SOG recon team operating across the border into Laos, conducting some of the most dangerous missions of the entire conflict. He had seen things in those jungle valleys that still gave him nightmares. He believed himself to be shockproof. He was wrong. Within 3 weeks of joining his first Australian patrol, Rosenfeld requested early extraction. His classified report, which would not be declassified until 2004, contained the assessment that would become infamous: they like the killing too much. But Rosenfeld's full report went far beyond that single damning sentence. He documented what he called a fundamental philosophical difference between American and Australian approaches to counterinsurgency warfare. American doctrine, he wrote, treated killing as an unfortunate necessity, a means to the end of achieving strategic objectives. Australian doctrine treated killing as the objective itself. The Australians, Rosenfeld observed, did not measure success in terms of territory controlled or populations protected. They measured success in terms of enemy eliminated. Their entire tactical system was optimized for one purpose: locating, tracking, and destroying human beings with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. And the men who operated this system had been selected, trained, and psychologically conditioned to excel at this single task. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were hunters, and they approached their work with a calm, methodical professionalism that Rosenfeld found genuinely frightening. The secret to their transformation lay in a selection process unlike anything the American military had ever attempted. The selection process for the Australian SAS was legendary even among special operations communities worldwide. Where American Special Forces selection focused heavily on leadership potential, language aptitude, and the ability to work with indigenous populations, Australian SAS selection seemed designed to identify men with a specific psychological profile. Individuals who could function in total isolation, who could remain patient for extended periods, and who could execute violence with complete emotional detachment. The selection course itself lasted 3 weeks and had a failure rate exceeding 90%. Candidates were pushed to their physical and psychological limits through a relentless series of trials that stripped away every comfort, every support system, every illusion of control. They marched through mountain terrain carrying loads that exceeded half their body weight. They navigated through trackless bush using only map and compass. They were subjected to resistance to interrogation training that American observers considered borderline torture. But the most significant aspect of CS selection wasn't the physical hardship. It was the systematic evaluation of each candidate's relationship with violence. Throughout the selection course, psychologists observed how candidates responded to stress, isolation, and simulated combat situations. They looked for men who remained calm under pressure, men who could make rational decisions even when exhausted, hungry, and afraid. And critically, men who showed what the evaluators called controlled aggression. The ability to employ lethal force when necessary without hesitation, remorse, or excessive emotional investment. The Australians understood something that American military planners often overlooked: the ability to function effectively in small team reconnaissance and direct action operations required a specific type of individual. Not a hero, not a leader, not someone seeking glory or redemption. What they needed were men who could view killing the way a carpenter views driving nails, as a task to be performed with skill and professionalism, neither more nor less. The men who emerged from this selection process were fundamentally different from their American counterparts. Where Green Berets were trained to be unconventional warriors, adaptable, charismatic, capable of operating across a wide spectrum of missions, Australian SAS operators were trained to be specialists, experts in one specific and terrible craft. And they practiced that craft with a dedication that bordered on obsession. The training that followed selection was designed to transform ordinary men into the jungle ghosts that enemy forces would come to fear. Much of this training drew on techniques developed by Aboriginal trackers who had worked with Australian military forces since the Second World War. Aboriginal Australians had spent over 60,000 years developing intimate knowledge of the Australian bush, the longest continuous culture in human history. They had evolved tracking abilities that seemed almost supernatural to European observers. An Aboriginal tracker could follow a trail days old through terrain that showed no visible signs of passage. He could determine from the faintest disturbances whether prey was male or female, healthy or injured, alert or unaware. The Australian SAS had recognized the value of this knowledge early in its existence. Aboriginal trackers had served with distinction during the Malayan Emergency, and their methods had been systematically integrated into SAS training doctrine. By the time the regiment deployed to Vietnam, every patrol included at least one member trained in Aboriginal tracking techniques. These techniques went far beyond simple visual observation. Trackers learned to read the jungle through all senses simultaneously. They detected changes in bird calls that indicated human presence. They identified the faint odors left by different ethnic groups: the fish sauce of Vietnamese, the sweat patterns of American soldiers, the distinctive smell of Chinese-supplied equipment. They felt temperature variations in the air that could indicate nearby cooking fires or concealed tunnel entrances, and they learned to move through the jungle in ways that left almost no trace. Aboriginal hunters had developed techniques for walking that distributed weight differently, minimizing the impact on vegetation. They had learned to control their breathing patterns to avoid startling wildlife. They had mastered methods of crossing streams, climbing obstacles, and penetrating dense undergrowth that seemed to violate the physical laws governing human movement. The SAS adapted all of these techniques for the specific environment of Vietnam. Operators learned to identify the particular species of birds whose alarm calls would betray enemy presence. They learned the growth patterns of Vietnamese jungle vegetation and how quickly disturbed plants would recover. They learned to read the subtle signs left by Viet Cong trail watchers, supply porters, and combat patrols. But perhaps most importantly, they learned patience And it was this patience that would prove most alien, and most terrifying, to American operators. American military culture, shaped by 2 centuries of continental warfare and refined through the industrial-scale conflicts of the 20th century, valued speed, firepower, and aggressive action. American soldiers were trained to close with and destroy the enemy through overwhelming force. They measured success in terms of ground seized, objectives captured, enemies eliminated in brief, violent engagements. Australian SAS doctrine represented the opposite approach. Patience was not just valued, it was foundational. A typical SAS patrol might spend 3 days moving into position for an ambush, then wait another 2 days for the target to appear. Operators learned to remain motionless for periods that would drive ordinary soldiers to madness. They learned to suppress every natural impulse toward movement, communication, or physical comfort. This patience extended to the engagement itself. Where American doctrine emphasized immediate, overwhelming response to enemy contact, Australian doctrine emphasized precision. A 5-man SAS patrol might observe an enemy unit for hours before making the decision to engage. They would identify leadership targets, establish kill zones, and plan withdrawal routes with methodical care. When they finally struck, the engagement would last seconds, a few precisely aimed shots, then immediate withdrawal before the enemy could respond. The results spoke for themselves. Throughout the Vietnam conflict, Australian SAS patrols suffered extraordinarily low casualty rates, despite conducting thousands of direct action missions. The combination of superior fieldcraft, patient observation, and precise engagement minimized the risks that plagued American special operations. But this effectiveness came at a cost that American observers struggled to articulate. The men who mastered these techniques had fundamentally changed themselves. They had trained away the normal, human responses to danger, discomfort, and violence. They had become something that no longer fit comfortably within the category of ordinary soldier. And some American observers believed they had become something else entirely. Sergeant First Class James McAllister was about to discover exactly what that meant. McAllister was a decorated Green Beret with 3 tours in Vietnam behind him when he volunteered for a joint operation with Australian SAS in September of 1970. He had heard the rumors about Australian methods, but he dismissed them as the typical inter-service rivalry that characterized American military culture. Surely the Australians couldn't be that different from American special operators. McAllister would later describe his experience in a series of letters to his wife that were never intended for publication. Decades after his passing, his family released these letters, and they provide one of the most detailed accounts of American perceptions of Australian SAS methods ever recorded. The first thing McAllister noticed was how the Australians moved. After 3 combat tours, he considered himself an expert in jungle movement. He could navigate through dense vegetation without leaving obvious trails. He could identify and avoid booby traps. He could maintain tactical awareness while covering difficult terrain. But the Australians operated on an entirely different level. McAllister wrote that watching them move through the jungle was like watching a nature documentary about predators. They seemed to flow between obstacles rather than moving around them. Their heads turned constantly, scanning in patterns that covered every possible threat axis. Their weapons never wavered from ready positions, yet they showed none of the tension that typically accompanied combat movement. And the silence, that supernatural silence that every American observer commented upon, was unnerving in ways that McAllister struggled to express. American patrols, even well-trained special operations patrols, made noise. Equipment shifted. Feet crunched vegetation. Breathing grew heavy during difficult movement. These sounds were accepted as inevitable, minimized through good technique but never eliminated entirely. The Australians made no sound at all. McAllister wrote that during the first day of movement toward their objective, he became convinced that he was alone. The 4 Australian operators surrounding him had become invisible, inaudible, as though they had transformed into spirits of the jungle itself. Only when the patrol leader raised his hand for a halt did McAllister realize that the others had been beside him the entire time. But the movement was only the beginning. What came next would fundamentally alter McAllister's understanding of what humans were capable of becoming. The patrol's objective was a suspected Viet Cong supply cache located approximately 15 kilometers inside enemy-controlled territory. American doctrine would have called for a helicopter insertion as close to the target as possible, rapid movement to the objective, and immediate extraction once the mission was complete. Total time on the ground, perhaps 6 to 8 hours. The Australians planned a 12-day operation. McAllister initially believed this timeline was an error. Surely, no patrol would remain in enemy territory for nearly 2 weeks when the objective could be reached in a single day. But the Australian patrol leader, a sergeant named Williamson, whose nickname was Shadow, explained that the extended timeline was essential to their method. The first 3 days would be spent moving into position with absolute stealth. The patrol would cover the 15 kilometers at a pace that American observers found almost incomprehensible, less than 1 kilometer per day. They would stop frequently, sometimes for hours, observing and listening for any sign of enemy presence. They would establish temporary positions, mark potential ambush sites, and identify withdrawal routes. By the time they reached their objective, they would know the surrounding area better than their own homes. The next 4 days would be spent observing the suspected cache location. They would identify supply schedules, guard rotations, and the patterns of enemy traffic through the area. They would locate every fighting position, every trail watcher, every alarm system the Viet Cong had established. And they would plan their engagement with the precision of a surgical team preparing for a complex operation. Only then, after 7 days of preparation, would they strike. And even the strike itself would follow a pattern, unlike anything McAllister had experienced. There would be no dramatic assault, no grenades, no automatic weapons fire, no calling for air support. The Australians would eliminate the enemy garrison one by one, using suppressed weapons and silent techniques. They would neutralize sentries without raising alarm. They would penetrate the cache complex like ghosts, accomplishing their mission before the enemy even understood they were under attack. The final 5 days would be spent withdrawing, using a route different from their approach, maintaining the same glacial pace and supernatural caution that had characterized the infiltration. McAllister was appalled. The American way of war valued speed and violence of action. What the Australians described sounded like the opposite. A slow, deliberate process that seemed almost leisurely. But Shadow's response to McAllister's objections would stay with the Green Beret for the rest of his life. The Australian sergeant explained that Americans were addicted to noise. They confused activity with effectiveness, firepower with success. But noise attracted attention. Helicopters could be heard for miles. Automatic weapons announced your presence to every enemy unit in the area. Artillery and airstrikes guaranteed that any survivors would know exactly where you were. The Australians preferred silence. In silence, they could accomplish missions that superior forces couldn't achieve with all their firepower and technology. In silence, they could strike where the enemy least expected. In silence, they could vanish before retaliation was possible. And in silence, they could hunt. What McAllister witnessed over the following 12 days would shatter everything he thought he knew about warfare. The patrol crossed into enemy territory on a moonless night in late September. What McAllister experienced over the following 12 days would eventually convince him that the rumors about Australian SAS were not only true, they were incomplete. The movement phase was exactly as Shadow had described. The patrol covered ground at a pace that seemed almost ridiculous, sometimes spending an hour to move 50 meters. They stopped at every sound, every anomaly, every faint suggestion that something in the jungle was not as it should be. And they detected threats that McAllister would never have noticed. On the second day, the patrol froze in position for 3 hours while a Viet Cong trail watcher passed within 20 meters of their location. McAllister never saw or heard the enemy, only the faint hand signals from Shadow indicating contact and the subsequent all clear. When he later asked how the Australians had detected the threat, Shadow simply tapped his nose. The fish sauce smell, carried on a light breeze, had given away the enemy's presence. On the 4th day, the patrol detected and bypassed an elaborate ambush position that had been established along their route. Again, McAllister saw nothing, but the Australians identified subtle signs. A slightly unnatural arrangement of fallen branches, birds that were silent when they should have been calling, a faint metallic glint that might have been sunlight reflecting from a weapon, and adjusted their course accordingly. By the time they reached the vicinity of the supply cache, McAllister had developed a profound respect for Australian fieldcraft. These men operated at a level he had never imagined possible. They seemed to possess senses that ordinary humans lacked, instincts that bordered on the supernatural. But respect would soon give way to something else entirely. The observation phase revealed that the supply cache was larger and more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested. Instead of the 8 to 10 guerrillas expected, The site was guarded by a full platoon of approximately 30 enemy fighters. They had established multiple fighting positions, strung alarm wires through the surrounding jungle, and posted sentries along every approach route. American doctrine would have called for an immediate abort. No five-man patrol could successfully engage a force 6 times its size. The sensible response was to withdraw, report the intelligence, and let a larger force handle the problem. Shadow didn't even consider withdrawal. Instead, he spent the next 4 days developing a plan that would allow his 5-man team to neutralize the entire enemy platoon. McAllister watched in growing horror as the Australian sergeant calmly discussed elimination rates, engagement sequences, and body disposal methods with the same detachment a businessman might use to discuss quarterly projections. The plan was elegant in its brutality. The Australians would infiltrate the enemy position at night, eliminating sentries one by one using silent techniques. They would work from the outside in, progressively tightening the noose until the remaining defenders realized they were under attack. By that point, the Australians calculated panic would set in. The survivors would break and run directly into the withdrawal routes the patrol had already identified and prepared with carefully positioned ambushes. McAllister objected. This wasn't a tactical operation. It was a massacre. Surely, the Australians couldn't be serious about engaging an entire platoon with 5 men. Shadow's response was delivered without emotion, without hesitation. He told McAllister that Americans thought in terms of firefights, exchanging bullets with the enemy until one side broke. But firefights were inefficient. They announced your presence, consumed ammunition, and created opportunities for reinforcement. The Australian way was different. They didn't fight. They eliminated. And the distinction, McAllister would come to understand, was the key to everything. The operation that followed would become the stuff of Special Forces legend and nightmare. The operation began at 0300 hours on the 11th day of the patrol. McAllister, despite his training and experience, was assigned to remain in a concealed position and observe. The Australians made it clear that his American training would be a liability in what was about to unfold. What McAllister witnessed over the next 4 hours would feature in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The first sentry went down without ever knowing he was in danger. One moment he was standing at his post, peering into the darkness. The next moment, shadow materialized behind him, and the man simply stopped. No sound. No struggle. Just the soft thump of a body being lowered to the ground. The second sentry fell the same way, and the third, and the fourth. McAllister watched through night vision equipment as the Australians flowed through the enemy position like water through sand. They worked in pairs, each covering the other, communicating through signals so subtle they were nearly invisible. They eliminated targets with knives, with garrots, with their bare hands. And they did it with a mechanical efficiency that defied everything McAllister thought he knew about human violence. By the time the remaining defenders realized something was wrong, nearly half their number had already fallen. The survivors did exactly what Shadow had predicted. They panicked, broke formation, and ran directly into the prepared ambush positions. The entire engagement lasted approximately 3 hours. When it was over, 28 Viet Cong fighters lay throughout the cache complex and along the surrounding trails. The Australians had not suffered a single casualty. They had not fired a single unsuppressed round. They had not raised any alarm that might bring reinforcement from other enemy units in the area. And they showed no more emotional reaction to the carnage than a farmer might show after completing a day's harvest. But what happened next pushed McAllister past his breaking point. The aftermath of the engagement revealed practices that pushed McAllister's moral boundaries past their breaking point. Standard Australian SAS procedure called for the patrol to collect intelligence from the eliminated fighters. Documents, maps, code books, anything that might prove useful. This was expected, even commendable. Every professional military force did the same, but the Australians went further. McAllister watched as the patrol members systematically mutilated the remains of the enemy fighters. The boots were cut, ensuring that spirits would crawl through eternity. Bodies were positioned in arrangements that conveyed specific messages. Personal effects were collected, not for intelligence value, but for later psychological distribution. And Shadow documented everything with a small camera, explaining that the images would be distributed through intelligence networks to enemy commanders. They would understand what had happened here. They would understand that the jungle ghosts had struck. again. And they would understand that nowhere in Phuoc Tuy province was safe. McAllister confronted Shadow about these practices. Surely this went beyond military necessity. Surely this constituted war crimes by any reasonable definition. Surely the Australians understood that they were crossing lines that civilized warriors were not supposed to cross. Shadow's response was delivered with the same calm detachment that characterized everything the Australians did. He asked McAllister how many American soldiers had fallen in Vietnam that year. When McAllister estimated approximately 4,000, Shadow nodded. He then asked how many enemy fighters had been eliminated. When McAllister couldn't answer, Shadow provided the number. Approximately 90,000 claimed, but probably half that in reality. The math, Shadow explained, didn't work. America was losing the war not because of enemy strength, but because American methods didn't affect enemy will to fight. Body counts meant nothing if replacements kept coming. Technology meant nothing if the enemy had already accepted the cost. What worked, what actually broke enemy morale, was terror. Specific, targeted terror that exploited psychological vulnerabilities. The cut boots weren't about hatred or sadism, they were about effectiveness. And effectiveness was all that mattered. McAllister wanted to argue, wanted to invoke the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, the fundamental principles that separated professional soldiers from savages, but he couldn't argue with the results. The patrol extracted without incident, following a withdrawal route that took them through terrain the Viet Cong had considered impassable. The entire operation, from infiltration to extraction, had lasted exactly 12 days. 28 enemy fighters had been eliminated, a major supply cache had been destroyed, and the psychological impact would ripple through enemy formations for months. McAllister submitted his after-action report through classified channels. His assessment was blunt. The Australians had developed methods that were devastatingly effective and almost certainly illegal. American forces could learn from their tactical innovations, but adopting their psychological warfare techniques would violate core principles of American military ethics. The report was received, classified, and buried. But McAllister wasn't the only American observer reaching similar conclusions. Throughout 1970, a steady stream of liaison officers, military advisors, and intelligence analysts cycled through the Australian task force at Nui Dat. Almost all of them reported the same basic findings. Australian SAS were the most effective counterinsurgency force in Vietnam, and their methods were something American forces should not attempt to replicate. The phrase that kept appearing in these reports was a variation on the same theme. Excessive enthusiasm for close combat, disturbing comfort with elimination operations, or the blunt assessment that would become legend. They liked the killing too much. But what these reports failed to capture, what the American observers couldn't quite articulate, was the deeper truth about what the Australians had become. And that truth would only emerge decades later, in the most unexpected way imaginable. The Australian SAS operators who served in Vietnam were not psychopaths, despite what some American observers believed. Psychological evaluations conducted before and after deployment showed no significant increase in antisocial tendencies, no evidence of the sadistic pleasure that American critics assumed motivated their methods. What the Australians had developed was something far more sophisticated and, in some ways, far more disturbing. A complete professional detachment from the act of killing. Normal soldiers, even elite special operators, maintain an emotional relationship with violence. They hate the enemy, or they fear him, or they feel guilt about eliminating him. These emotions serve as psychological safeguards, preventing the slide into pure brutality that marks war criminals and terrorists. Australian SAS training had systematically eliminated these emotional connections. Their operators viewed killing the way a surgeon views cutting, an unpleasant but necessary professional skill to be applied with technical precision. The enemy was not a person to be hated or feared. The enemy was a problem to be solved, and the solution was applied without emotional investment. This detachment extended to the controversial psychological warfare techniques that so disturbed American observers. The cut boots, the body displays, the terror tactics. These weren't expressions of hatred or cruelty. They were tools, instruments designed to achieve specific psychological effects on enemy morale. The Australians applied them with the same professional objectivity they applied to everything else. And that objectivity, more than any specific practice, was what truly frightened the American Green Berets who worked alongside them. The controversy over Australian methods reached its peak in the final years of the war. As American forces began their withdrawal, questions emerged about what lessons should be drawn from the Vietnam experience. The Australian SAS represented an uncomfortable data point that American military analysts struggled to integrate. On one hand, the Australians had achieved results that American forces couldn't match. Their kill ratios were extraordinary. Their casualty rates were minimal. Their area of operations had achieved a level of security that existed nowhere else in South Vietnam. By any purely military metric, they were the most successful special operations force of the entire conflict. On the other hand, their methods raised profound ethical questions. The systematic use of psychological terror, the mutilation of enemy remains, the deliberate targeting of spiritual beliefs. These practices seemed to cross lines that professional soldiers were not supposed to cross. Even if they were effective, could they be justified? The American military never resolved this tension. The classified reports on Australian methods remained buried in restricted archives. The lessons that might have been learned were deliberately ignored, and the controversy faded into the same historical amnesia that eventually consumed most of the Vietnam experience. But among special operations professionals, the legend of the Australian SAS persisted. Green Berets who had served alongside them passed stories to the next generation. Special Forces bars from Fort Bragg to Coronado echoed with tales of the jungle ghosts, the silent hunters who had achieved what American firepower couldn't, and the phrase that summarized American feelings about their Australian allies, "They like the killing too much," became a kind of shorthand for everything that made the SAS both admired and feared. The legacy would echo across 5 decades, and eventually explode into international scandal. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends far beyond the controversial methods that disturbed American observers. Their operational innovations influenced special operations doctrine worldwide, even when that influence was never officially acknowledged. The concept of reconnaissance in force, small patrols that combined intelligence gathering with direct action, was eventually adopted by special operations units throughout the Western Alliance. The emphasis on patient observation, precise engagement, and immediate withdrawal became standard doctrine for counterterrorism operations. Aboriginal tracking techniques, refined through SAS training and application in Vietnam, were studied and adapted by special operations units from multiple nations. The understanding that human targets leave detectable signatures beyond visual traces revolutionized the practice of manhunting operations. Even the psychological warfare techniques that American observers found so disturbing eventually influenced counterinsurgency doctrine. The recognition that enemy morale could be targeted as systematically as enemy logistics informed operations from Northern Ireland to Iraq to Afghanistan. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the demonstration that effectiveness in counterinsurgency warfare required a fundamental shift in military psychology. The Australian SAS had shown that conventional soldier mentalities, aggressive, firepower-focused, measuring success in terrain captured and enemies eliminated in direct combat, were poorly suited to the demands of jungle warfare against guerrilla forces. What worked was something different. Something that required operators to think and move, and yes, eliminate differently than traditional soldiers. Something that American military culture, with its emphasis on heroic confrontation and technological superiority, had difficulty accepting. The Australians had found that something. And the price they paid, the transformation of ordinary men into the cold, efficient hunters that American Green Berets came to fear, remained a cautionary tale about the costs of true effectiveness in unconventional war. The question that haunted American observers, whether Australian methods constituted legitimate military innovation or a descent into war crimes, has never been definitively answered. The practices documented in classified reports clearly violated the letter of international humanitarian law. The mutilation of remains, the targeting of spiritual beliefs, the systematic terrorization of enemy combatants, these actions meet most definitions of war crimes. If they had been conducted by enemy forces against American soldiers, they would have been prosecuted without hesitation. But the Australians operated in a moral gray zone that defied easy categorization. Their methods, however disturbing, were directed exclusively against enemy combatants. They did not target civilians. They did not torture prisoners for sadistic pleasure. They did not commit atrocities in the heat of combat anger. Their actions were calculated, controlled, and directed toward specific military objectives. And, critically, their methods worked. In a war characterized by futility, waste, and failure, the Australian SAS achieved measurable results. They secured their area of operations. They broke enemy morale. They saved lives, both Australian and South Vietnamese civilian, through their effectiveness. Does effectiveness justify methods that would otherwise be condemned? This is the fundamental question that the Australian SAS experience poses, and it has no easy answer. Military ethicists continue to debate the boundaries between legitimate psychological warfare and prohibited terror tactics. International lawyers continue to argue about the limits of proportionality in counterinsurgency operations. And special operations professionals continue to grapple with the tension between effectiveness and ethics that the Australians exemplified. The only certainty is that the question cannot be avoided. In an era of asymmetric warfare, counterterrorism operations, and hybrid conflicts, the methods that disturbed American Green Berets in 1970 remain painfully relevant. The lessons of the Australian SAS, both positive and negative, continue to inform debates about how democratic societies should fight enemies who operate outside conventional military frameworks. But the final chapter of this story was still waiting to be written, and it would vindicate the worst fears of those long-ago American observers. 50 years after the last Australian soldiers departed Vietnam, the controversy over SAS methods has taken on new dimensions. The Brereton Report, released in 2020, documented allegations of war crimes committed by Australian SAS in Afghanistan. The report concluded that at least 39 Afghan civilians and prisoners had been unlawfully eliminated by Australian special operators between 2005 and 2016. The methods described in the report, extrajudicial executions, evidence planting, cover-ups, bore disturbing similarities to practices that had first emerged in the jungles of Phuoc Toi province. Critics argued that the Vietnam-era culture of the SAS had never been properly reformed. The emphasis on kill counts, the tolerance for gray zone operations, the psychological distance between operators and victims. All of these patterns, critics claimed, had persisted across generations and eventually produced the atrocities documented in Afghanistan. Defenders of the regiment countered that the Brereton allegations represented aberrations, not institutional culture. The Australian SAS, they argued, remained one of the most professional and disciplined special operations units in the world. The actions of a few rogue operators should not tar the entire organization or its honorable history. But the question raised by the original American observers, do they like the killing too much? Took on renewed urgency. Had the Australian SAS created a culture that selected for and rewarded precisely the psychological characteristics that led to war crimes? Had the effectiveness that so impressed and disturbed Green Berets in Vietnam come at a moral cost that was only now becoming apparent? The debate continues, and it shows no sign of resolution. For the American Green Berets who served alongside Australian SAS in Vietnam, the experience left permanent marks. Many described their time with the Australians as the most intense, most professionally instructive, and most morally troubling of their careers. Michael DeLong, the sergeant whose observations opened this narrative, eventually rose to the rank of general and served as deputy commander of Central Command during the initial phases of the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns. He never publicly discussed his experiences with Australian SAS, but colleagues reported that he maintained a lifelong fascination with the ethical boundaries of special operations. James McAllister, whose letters provided such detailed documentation of Australian methods, left the military in 1972. He became a teacher, spending 30 years educating young people about the costs and consequences of war. His letters were released after his passing in 2018, and they have become essential primary sources for historians studying the ethics of counterinsurgency warfare. Thomas Harrigan, who witnessed the cut boot ritual on his first Australian patrol, completed 4 tours in Vietnam before transferring to training command. He spent the remainder of his career developing methods to prepare American special operators for the psychological challenges of irregular warfare. His training programs, colleagues noted, always included extensive discussion of ethical boundaries, where they should be drawn, and why they mattered. These men and hundreds like them carried the Australian experience back to American special operations communities. They spread stories, raised questions, and helped shape a generation of discussion about the nature of elite warfare. And they never forgot the men they called the jungle ghosts, the silent hunters who had mastered a form of war that Americans could admire, fear, and never quite replicate. The fundamental question raised by the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam remains unanswered. Is there a form of military effectiveness that comes at too high a moral cost? American military doctrine has traditionally answered yes. The laws of armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions, the traditions of military professionalism, all assume that certain methods are prohibited regardless of their effectiveness. Soldiers are expected to accept tactical disadvantages rather than cross ethical red lines. But the Australian SAS demonstrated that those red lines could be crossed, that effective counterinsurgency methods existed on the far side of conventional military ethics, and that men could be trained to employ those methods with professional detachment. Their success posed an uncomfortable challenge to American assumptions about the relationship between military effectiveness and moral constraints. The challenge has only grown more urgent in the decades since Vietnam. Modern special operations forces face enemies who recognize no ethical constraints, who deliberately target civilians, who use terror as a primary weapon. The temptation to respond in kind, to adopt methods that work rather than methods that comply with international law, grows stronger with each asymmetric conflict. The Australian SAS experience offers both a model and a warning. Their methods worked. Their results were impressive. But the psychological and institutional effects of those methods persist across generations, emerging in allegations of war crimes and institutional dysfunction that continue to this day. Perhaps the American Green Berets who feared their Australian allies understood something important. Perhaps their discomfort reflected an instinct that shouldn't be dismissed, an understanding that some forms of effectiveness come at prices that shouldn't be paid. Or perhaps the Australians understood something equally important, that war is a brutal business, that enemies who don't play by the rules cannot always be defeated by those who do, and that the costs of ineffectiveness can be measured in the lives of soldiers and civilians alike. The debate continues, the questions remain, and the legend of the men who like the killing too much endures, a permanent challenge to anyone who believes that the ethics of warfare can be reduced to simple rules. In the end, the story of why American Green Berets feared Australian SAS is not really a story about methods or tactics or psychological warfare techniques. It is a story about what humans are capable of becoming when they are selected, trained, and deployed for a single specific purpose. The Australian SAS operators who served in Vietnam were ordinary men who had been transformed into something extraordinary. And something disturbing. They had developed capabilities that exceeded anything in American special operations experience. They had achieved results that American forces couldn't match, and they had done so through a process that fundamentally altered their relationship with violence, with the end of life, and with humanity itself. American observers recognized this transformation, and they responded with a mixture of admiration and fear that has never been fully resolved. They admired the professionalism, the discipline, the almost superhuman fieldcraft, but they feared what that professionalism implied, that the most effective soldiers might be those who had lost something essentially human in the process of becoming effective. The phrase "they like the killing too much" was never quite accurate. The Australians didn't like killing any more than a surgeon likes cutting. What disturbed American observers wasn't pleasure. It was absence. The absence of the emotions that normally surrounded lethal violence. The absence of the psychological safeguards that prevented ordinary soldiers from becoming something else. That absence was what made the Australian SAS so effective. And that absence was what made them genuinely frightening to the American Green Berets who worked alongside them. The lesson persists to this day, embedded in the culture and doctrine of special operations units worldwide. Effectiveness has costs. Excellence has prices. And the men who become truly exceptional at the business of war may lose something in the process, something that cannot be easily measured or recovered. The Jungle Ghosts understood this truth. They accepted the price and paid it willingly. And their legend, equal parts admiration and warning, endures as a reminder of what special operations warfare truly demands. This is their story. This is why America's elite warriors came to fear their closest allies. And this is why the phrase "they like the killing too much" continues to echo through special operations communities. A permanent question mark at the heart of unconventional warfare.